All right, let's finish up with the final of our regions for this chapter, and that's the Aegean, specifically the Mediterranean area that we're going to be talking about is in reference to the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. But we're going to focus primarily on the Minoans because this seems to be, as I've been talking about a few times, most likely a primary state form, an instance of primary state formation. That's not to say that they were not knowledgeable of other cultures in the vicinity, in the area. They arose out of their own culture, but they seem to have followed their own path. So even though they were influenced by surrounding regions, specifically the Middle East and Asia Minor, and probably quite a fair bit from Egypt, they emerged as their own entity. And the Minoans, even the word Minoans, is sort of a funny history to it. Arthur Evans, very famous archaeologist from the 19th century, excavated on the island of Crete, very famously at the site of Knossos in Crete. And this was a time when archaeologists were flamboyant, they were public figures, and Arthur Evans was at Oxford and he was a classicist, so he was well versed in Greek mythology especially. And so when he excavated the palace, as it's called, at Knossos, he came up with a certainly incorrect but very popularizing word to call it. He called it the Palace of King Minos, which is a figure from Greek mythology. And you may not know King Minos, but he was the king when had dominion over the labyrinth that was constructed by Daedalus, the very famous maze that no mortal could actually find their way out of on their own. And at the heart of this maze was the Minotaur, the half man, half bull who ate human flesh. So pretty mythological, pretty made up. So for an archaeologist to say, I have found the Palace of Minos, there's all of this mythology that comes along with it. It was a marketing tool, let's face it. Arthur Evans became famous off of this, and he came up with some pretty clever ways to make his archaeological discoveries sound exciting. But they're exciting on their own, actually. The Palace at Knossos is amazing archaeology. It's extremely well preserved, and more importantly, we have to give credit where credit is due. Arthur Evans was excavating on Crete, and there had been really no major excavations there. This is one of the largest islands in the Mediterranean. It has its own internal geography that's varied, so it's its own little mini continent sort of a thing. It's got its own landmass. And so who was living there, and when were they living there, and what were they doing? Well, Arthur Evans opened our eyes to this, and we still call the society that he discovered there the Minoan society, based on his attribution of this to being the palace at Minos. It is not, but it's been used as a sort of especially in the 19th century, as a very convenient tool to look at the emergence of Western civilization, that is to say European civilization, because Crete, technically, as far as geography, political geography goes, is part of Europe. It's now part of Greece. Even though it's an island in the Mediterranean, the Aegean Islands, it's the southernmost of the Aegean Islands that are a cluster of small islands in between Greece and Turkey. So what was Minoan society like? Was it a state? How did that form? How did they function? We've seen just previously that there's no one-size-fits-all definition of a state. Some have some attributes, some have others. So what do we get in Minoan and Mycenaean, which was centered? The Mycenaean culture was centered on the mainland of Greece, in the plain of the Argolid, in particular, and the Aegean area is made up of a few areas. So the Mycenaeans were centered mainly on the Peloponnesian peninsula of Greece. So Greece comes down to the south like this, and then there's the Gulf of Corinth, and then there's a peninsula called the Peloponnese, which is to the south of that. And then in between Greece and Turkey, you have a bunch of islands, the Aegean Islands, and then on the south you have Crete. And both Crete and the mainland of Greece have both mountainous areas and some open plains for things like growing crops. The so-called Mediterranean triad of crops: wheat, olive, and grapes. And these are things that we find archaeological evidence for them growing. So the Minoans and Mycenaeans have often been characterized as two very different types of societies. That the Minoans, in popular, or at least the way they were originally presented, was they were peaceful. The Minoans were peace-loving and very hierarchical. That they didn't really have one leader. It was sort of very gentle community, and the Mycenaeans were considered to be the warriors. Both of these communities, both of these cultures existed on the sea, and so they've been described as thalassocracies, that is to say, rule by the sea. And so when we think of the Mesopotamia or areas like that, we think of landscapes. And so how does a culture dominate a landscape? Well, in the Aegean, it's a seascape. And so they dominate by the sea. Usually when you or I come up to a body of water, we stop at the shore, we look out, and we say, I can go no further. But the Minoans and the Mycenaeans saw this as a highway. They had boats, and they were extremely skilled at using them. And so they had a great experience at hopping from island to island and to island, some of which you could see from one another, one island to the next, others that you couldn't. So they ruled the sea, and they also became then intermediaries through trade with the Middle East and other places. The way they've been described in the past, at least, was the Minoans were peace lovers and the Mycenaeans were the aggressors. But is this accurate? Is this true? Let's look at some of the evidence and test this analysis that is of old. First thing to remember is that there's a lot of similarities between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. All of these cultures had what we call polities. These are autonomous political units that are probably organized on the level of states. So it's state level, it's urban, but do they actually have an overarching state level identity that ties and binds these cities together? And in fact, our good friend Colin Renfrew, who we've seen several times before, came up with a model for how to talk about this sort of peer polity interaction, where you have states that are competing entities that are have their own individual ideas of themselves, but that competition actually binds them together into an overarching system. So states that are actually not necessarily greatest of friends, but they share so many cultural similarities that we can call them states, perhaps. Occupation in the human occupation in the Aegean goes at least back to the Neolithic period, perhaps even earlier, and it became more and more complex during the Bronze Age, so from about 3000 BC onwards. And power started to become centralized from about, especially in Crete, from around 1900 BC. So it took about 1,000 years of development of power to be centralized, and you have what's called the proto-palatial and the neo and the palatial and the neo-palatial periods. And Mycenaean power centralization seems to have occurred a little bit later, from about 1500 BC. And in fact, the Minoans, as they developed, started to see encroaching influence from the Mycenaeans. So the Mycenaeans were a very powerful cultural influence upon the Minoans, who were already in Crete. The Minoan site of Knossos and other Minoan sites around the Aegean have really elaborate and evocative imagery because of some of the preservation of the sites. As we're going to see, there were some catastrophic site destructions, including the volcanic eruption of Akrotiri on the island of Thera, or Santorini as it's called today, that preserved some of these cities, these urban areas of the Minoans, including plastered wall paintings. Knossos also has plaster wall paintings that are well preserved, sometimes two-story, even possibly three-story buildings in the Palace of Knossos. These are the palace at Knossos in particular is an extremely elaborate and huge structure, and so that's why it was described as a palace. In fact, there's a so-called throne room that Arthur Evans discovered and described, but we now have learned that actually, as usual, archaeological sites have a lifespan. It's not just a snapshot of one time period. That actually the palace at Knossos grew and expanded and changed. And as we've seen, the Mycenaeans by about 1500 were influencing some of the culture of the Minoans. So what started out as Minoan became fused with Mycenaean influence. So the throne, as it turns out, is a later addition. And it's a kind of a strange throne because it's not really in a throne room. It's kind of in a side room, almost a hallway. So it's probably not some throne room, and it's certainly not configured. The palace at Knossos is not configured like a Mycenaean palace. There's a central court in the palace at Knossos. Remember, this is Minoan, and it's big enough for large audiences. And it seems as though this was more of a corporate identity, that this was, there may not have been a central ruler in Minoan culture. And in fact, the evidence we're gathering from Crete seems to show that actually there were probably small little villas that had their own little farmsteads, and these palaces, because there's more than just Knossos, there's other palaces that were perhaps communal centers for things like feasting or dancing, or, as has been depicted in a lot of artwork from the Minoans, bullfighting of some sort. They were famous for so-called bull leaping, and this was rather than you have in places like Spain bullfighting where you kill the bull. They may very well have killed the bull at the end of the festival in Minoan periods, but what you would have is a very brave person who would face a charging bull and they would leap over them, usually by vaulting over the top and then pushing off with their arms and flipping over the back of them. And this is depicted in artwork on some of the frescoes, which I actually have a picture in your slideshow showing that. So the Minoan culture may not have been hierarchical in that way. It may have been heterarchical. And these so-called palaces may not have been palaces for a ruler, but palaces for a corporate identity, maybe for communal storage of foodstuffs. And so in that sense, perhaps they were a little bit more peaceful and cooperative rather than dominating and hierarchical. But this starts to change when you see influence from the Mycenaeans. The palaces become elaborate. They become the Mycenaean palace at Pylos is elaborate, is massive structure, but importantly, it has a central, what's called a megaron. That means big room, and this has a sort of an open skylight above a hearth in the center. At the other end of this, you walk in and you see this big fireplace with a shaft of light coming down, 4 pillars around this, and then on the other end of this very impressive scene that you walk into with smoke rising up through the hole in the ceiling, you see the throne of the ruler. And these are painted, and unlike at Knossos, you don't have any large tombs with differential burials, with some with huge elaborate grave goods. But in the Mycenaean palaces, you have huge tombs for elites. So it does seem like there is a more hierarchical structure where authority is spread out with the Minoans. And with the Mycenaeans, it seems to be more hierarchical with a ruler at the top. And in fact, this goes to the ideology of some of the way of thinking of the Mycenaeans as well, because we actually have some writing from this period. I'm going to give another lecture on scripts and their formation, but it's important to bring up a couple of ways of writing here in this in the Aegean. There's a couple of linear scripts. One's called linear A and one's called linear B. Linear A has not been deciphered yet. We don't know what it says. We know elements and parts of its structure, but we can't read it. We don't know what it says, and it's actually quite rare. But linear B very famously was deciphered and cracked the code by Michael Ventris. And linear B has been now shown to be a form of Greek writing, at least in some cases. And both of these are found in the Aegean. The linear A seems to be used by the Minoans. Some believe that it's a Semitic script, but this isn't proven. And as we now know, linear B, used primarily by the Mycenaeans, which actually says things about both the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Linear B is Greek script. And so the identity of these people may have actually been different languages. They may have had different cultures. They may have come from different places and found different similarities and differences between each other and with their trading partners in the Middle East and Africa and Europe. And we also know a little bit about the changing nature of their cultures. There were some catastrophes that took place that I hinted at earlier. Akrotiri, the site of Akrotiri on the slopes of the Thera volcano and the island of Santorini, Thera erupted in about 1600 BC, and it covered the site of Akrotiri in hot ash and melted things, but also preserved a lot of things as well, up to 2 stories. And so there's some pretty amazing architecture and artifacts that have been preserved. It was extremely destructive for the people that were trapped there on the island. And some have proposed that this was the end of the Minoan culture, right? So we see the Mycenaeans coming in at about 1500, and the Thera eruption took place about 1500 BC. So I'm not going to get into the controversy about the dating of the Thera eruption, but the point is that if the eruption of this and its subsequent tsunami caused the collapse of the Minoan culture, you would expect to see some evidence for that. But it actually took about 100 years for the Minoan culture to really decline. And so it probably may have been something causal. It may have been one element of the Minoan losing its grip on their dominance, their thalassocracy of the sea, but also it probably had a lot to do with the fact that the up-and-comers, the Mycenaeans, were actually strong and aggressive and moving into Minoan's territory. Also, it could have been, we've seen this a few times, that ideology is extremely important for a state holding together. It's an invented thing. A state exists in the brain of people. And so if you lose confidence in that state and its ability to function, then you've lost the battle, right? You've lost your state. So the Thera eruption may not have been economically or socially a total destruction, but it may have just presented enough of a challenge in the mind of the Minoans that they're like, maybe the gods aren't with us. Maybe our kings or our rulers, our leaders aren't with us. Maybe we aren't as solid of a foundation as we thought we were. So that's all I really want to say today for the Aegean. There's obviously a lot more that could be said, but I'll finish it here, and I'm going to have a couple more supplementary lectures about these subjects that I'll come back and see you about. See you then.